Michael Chossudovsky, you're back. I'm really glad that you two are patient because we kept you waiting as well. Shall we just go ahead and start where you left off last time?
Well, certainly, I wanted to bring forth something which might be somewhat controversial. This is not a public health crisis. It is a crisis which has created a public health crisis, but there's a nuance. And we have medical doctors which are focusing on a public health crisis quite legitimately, without understanding that at the outset, in March of 2020, the lockdown was conducive to economic and social chaos and impoverishment in all regions of the world simultaneously. Now, I wanted to focus on that because, in fact, none of my colleagues, I'm an economist with a training in quantitative methods and so on and so forth, I can look at statistics. But anybody in first grade Economics 101, if I'd asked the question, what happens when you confine the labor force of 190 countries in their homes, quarantined or whatever, and you order the closing down of productive, commercial, trading activities worldwide? Of course, it happened in stages. Maybe I'm simplifying, but if I asked my students what happens if you confine the labor force, well, economic crisis. It's obvious, okay? And what I'd like to address as well is the fact that economic warfare has characterized conflicts between nation states, war between nation states from early humanity, but particularly, let's say, from the antiquity. In other words, you invade, or you conquer, or you take control. And in all cases, these acts by one nation state against another nation state are based on dominant economic interests. Whether we take the Crusades, whether we look at the British East India Company and so on and so forth, it's ultimately the economic interests which are behind these wars which establish the nature of warfare. And of course, you come up with some kind of phony ideological concept that we're going after the Muslims, or we're going after the whatever. I mean, you put a bad guy label on this. But what I'm saying is that we have reached a point in our history where this action has been launched under a consensus, a narrative, a fake science, and it has been imposed and accepted by more than 190 countries. And my understanding...
Well, by their leaders, not by the people.
By their leaders. Now, by their leaders, that means they've been co-opted. It's obvious. Yes. Either they've been co-opted, threatened, or whatever. But the issue there, and the issue there is that this process has, in a sense, it's a war against humanity. It's not a war against a nation state, but it is also a war of a nation state which is co-opted against the people of that nation state. So, and then we have to look at the economic groups behind them, behind this action. And I can tell you from my experience that they are exactly the same groups which were involved in the numerous wars in the wake of World War II, but in fact, even World War II itself, or even going back to World War I. And they are the same groups which are behind the neoliberal agenda, which was initiated in the 1980s or even both before, which consists in imposing on a piecemeal basis, country by country, very intensive strong economic medicine, to use the term of the IMF. Well, we have the so-called IMF Structural Adjustment Program. Now, what I'm saying is that in effect, you'll find an extension of the neoliberal agenda, the austerity measures imposed by governments, the regime changes. All this is part of it. But now these elites have put together something under the disguise of the World Health Organization, which in effect is an act of economic conquest and destabilization. And we see it happening. And I think nobody in my profession, economics, political economy, or even the social scientists, political scientists, sociologists, have addressed this. What they'll say, it's the virus. The virus has caused the economic crisis. And then they will start analyzing, what's happened there, blah, blah, blah. Okay? Now, what I'm saying is this is economic warfare, and it's an appendage of an act of warfare. Well, it's also the same forces which are behind the war in Ukraine. But the same people, the same economic interests. I don't want to personalize, but I mean, look at the dictatorships in Latin America when we had those military coups. Well, I lived through two of them. Who came in? Kissinger and Rockefeller, and then they had conversations with the dictators. Now these, let's say the landscape has changed since then, but neoliberal economic measures, we know what they are, and they're piecemeal. Now, in Yugoslavia, the World Bank put forth a bankruptcy program, okay, which was then led to massive collapse of the industrial system of the industry in Yugoslavia. Now, here you have another dimension. You don't need to go in with piecemeal. You don't need to send in the World Bank mission there. You simply do it. But it's very important. This economic act of economic warfare and its aftermath then is sustained by the World Bank, the IMF, the regional development banks. They come to the rescue of these countries. And they said, oh, you're in a mess now. Your economy has collapsed. We're going to lend you money. And so that you have in a sense a global debt crisis which is unfolding. Yeah. That's the
Would you agree that if you look at the example of Greece during the crisis, which then became first the housing crisis, then the economic crisis, and then it became an EU crisis. If you look at the example of Greece, would you say that this could have been something like a trial run for what they're doing now?
Well, it certainly was. But there were many trial runs from the 1980s. Yeah. IMF conditionalities were imposed on all developing countries. Then in the early 90s, they were imposed in the late 80s, starting with Poland in 89, the Big Bang, okay, Romania. Yeah. Now, they then subjected these countries to strong economic medicine, and they came up and said austerity is what you need, and disengage your resources from the real economy. And of course, it's dollar-denominated debt. So it also has to do with the dominance of the dollar. The Federal Reserve calls the shots, but it's of course a set of private banking institutions. So those we call them conditionalities, IMF conditionalities. They were deadly and as you pointed out, the latest stage of these IMF reforms was was Greece and Iceland, and in fact the entire European Union went in some form or another, and the whole objective was to dismantle the welfare state. Now,
yeah,
I can say that today what they've done in one fell swoop on the 11th of March was to dismantle the welfare state and lead to privatization. That's the solution. And all these countries are in the stranglehold of debt. So there's not a single head of state or head of government, because it's dollar-denominated debt, and the European Union as well. Now, the European Union may be complicit in this agenda. We're not dealing with nation states anymore. The nation state doesn't exist.
But what we can see clearly, I think, is through these IMF measures. The IMF is, of course, part of the club, World Economic Forum, WHO, all these global NGOs. But through these measures by the IMF, isn't it true that these austerity measures really drove countries into debt and therefore made them dependent on IMF money, on those people, on those private people who are controlling these NGOs, just like they're controlling the global corporations? Or is that an oversimplification?
No, I think you're absolutely right. But the thing is that the IMF is theoretically an intergovernmental organization linked to the UN, but it's controlled by Wall Street. Okay, we know that. Even the appointments, of course, we had various scandals attached. I won't go into that, but I mean, the IMF and the World Bank are intergovernmental organizations. They have a link to the U.S. Treasury. They are U.S. constructs, but they're controlled by Wall Street, and they establish a consensus. Now, what boggles the mind is that immediately in the wake of the lockdown and the collapse of financial markets, though those collapse of financial markets were engineered. Okay, they were engineered, and then it led to enrichment. And the IMF came to the rescue. The World Bank came to the rescue. Private creditors came to the rescue. Now, that means that they now have a stranglehold on every single country on the planet. Every single country on the planet is under the stranglehold of debt by different creditors, but ultimately, if you look at the power structures, it's let's say it's BlackRock, the investment portfolios, BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard, etc. And those, of course, they're in the shadows. They don't reveal their identity, but in effect, the Rothschild family and the Rockefellers control part of it with a whole series of partners. And now, what is very convenient for these financial interests is that they're invisible. They can take over countries, and they're also taking over countries like Cuba and Venezuela. Okay, which are supposed to be on they're on the blacklist of the United States, and they're the object of sanctions and so on. And they also have an inroad into Russia, because Russia adopted this consensus. Now I'm in contact with many people on the so-called left progressives, and I'm on their blacklist because I'm a professor at the National University of Nicaragua, in fact, and my colleagues simply don't agree with me at all, and they don't want to even enter into debate. They don't know that Daniel Ortega, for instance, the progressive leader of the Sandinista movement, they accept the Pfizer vaccine without any kind of review, even the kind of review that we're familiar with, looking at the confidential documents and the data and so on. So I think, well, to get back to the timeline of this crisis, and I've spent more than 2 years on this. Okay, now it's clear that this was prepared well in advance. okay? Well in advance. Several years in advance. And the vaccine, it's very clear, even we have documents, that it was already in the pipeline in early 2019. And we have also evidence that the PCR test was already chosen to be the way to identify the pandemic. But what I think is very important is that, one, assuming that the PCR test gives viable results, they didn't have those viable results when they declared the emergency. On the 30th of January, there were 83 cases out of China. And that is PCR positive, okay? 83 cases out of 6.4 billion people. Now, anybody who has a little bit of understanding of high school statistics will say, oh, no, there's something wrong there. You got 83 cases. Now, when we get to February, Tedros makes the announcement, 1,078 cases, and he says, oh, it's getting really dangerous. And then on the day of March 11, there were 44,279 cases. In the meantime, they started to speed up the testing. Now, yes. And incidentally, today, the cumulative confirmed cases are more than 10,000 times what they were on March 11, 2020. Okay? And in the last 6-7 months, they have doubled. And now we are told that the pandemic is over. We've never had more cases. These are not real cases, they're fake cases, because they've introduced, well, I think that I mentioned that the last time we spoke, that both in the United States and Canada and many other countries, around the world, they're introducing the antigen and home tests. And in Canada, it's 290 million home tests for a population of 38.5 million people. It's 1 in 7 home tests for every single person in Canada, which means inevitably the figures are going to go fly high. And then they started inventing this whole thing with the variants. Now we know that this is nonsense, but even the doctors pick it up. How can there be a variant when the terms of reference of the PCR test is a virus of 2002, 2003? Okay. If we look at, we've read the Drossman report and so on and so forth, and we know that the virus has never been identified, and we know that they took that 2003 virus as a terms of reference, and I have a hunch that this was for intellectual property rights. Mm-hmm. I think David Martin has looked into that aspect, but I think that's something we should look into. But clearly, they took the PCR test because it's a convenient test. It can be applied anywhere in the airports, et cetera, and then they use these statistics, which are absolutely meaningless, particularly in view of the fact that both the WHO and the CDC have repealed them officially. Well, not CDC officially, and WHO with innuendos. But there we are. We've got that preparatory stage, which may go back several years. I recall now the statement that Bill Gates made about a pandemic, the pandemic of a monkeypox pandemic. He made that statement in 2017. Okay, at the Munich Security Conference, and then he made it again last November. But the thing is that here we are, we have ample evidence that this is a fraud, but we have to look at the fact that this is an act of war, which is also integrated into the broader military agenda. I can't come to any other conclusion. It's one procedure which has never been applied in world history, of paralyzing the economy of every single country on planet, and directing again against 7.9 billion people. Now, what I should say is that if we want to periodize, we have a preparatory planning period, complex. Then we have the transition leading up to the lockdown on March 11, 2020, etc. And then we have a whole set of economic crises, which are very, very serious, which are a means of enrichment of this milliardaire class. And then the second phase takes us to the vaccine. Now, the vaccine is biological warfare. I think we have enough data, and it's no use. It's biological warfare. It's crimes against humanity, as you brought it out. It's also the criminalization of justice. And it is consistent with the lockdown. The lockdown is also a way of killing people. And I'm...
Of course.
Yeah, and I mean, the doctors don't see that. Mortality, morbidity emerges when people are impoverished, when they don't have access to health, etc., etc. So the lockdown is perhaps even more at the time the lockdown was more diabolical, but when we look at the two things together, the vaccine and the lockdown are the two pillars for the impoverishment of people worldwide, and also, it is a depopulation agenda. Okay, it is de facto. I don't want to enter into the debate on that, but when my experience as an economist is, if you apply these austerity measures in individual countries, you impoverish people. So it's global poverty. Now, then we have all this nonsense about sustainable development, 2030, the Rio, 1992 agreement, blah, 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 environment, CO2, and all of this is funded by the foundation, Soros, Rockefeller et al., and the UN is, of course, complicit, and it really is to provide a sort of neoliberalism with a human face. And they say we're against poverty, we're going to, by the year 2030, we're going to reach all these objectives. They're not. They're doing exactly the opposite. And
they're standing everything on its head. They're standing everything on its head and using nice-sounding words for what is really going to be a totalitarian regime.
Well, absolutely. The thing is that all these people, so-called leftists, are either they're totally misled, but they have this sort of humanitarian discourse, Black Lives Matters, the environment, but they don't look at who's financing them. I've had this kind of confrontation with many friends when I saw that. The World Social Forum. The World Social Forum, which was really they was presenting this as an alternative to the World Economic Forum, or as a parallel venue, and it was taking place at the same time of the year in mid to late January. And I said to my colleagues, how can you confront the Rockefellers when the Rockefellers are paying your travel expenses? Okay, all these all the World Social Forum was initially funded by the Ford Foundation. Now, and then all the other things where the Extinction Rebellion, the Black Lives Matters, all this, every single organized process of resistance against a totalitarian regime have been co-opted, and the trade unions as well. The trade unions as well. They go to Davos every year. Now,
Yeah, you
Mind
know
you.
what? The other day we spoke about how this is all eugenics driven. And we spoke about the fact that the first person to represent UNESCO was Julian Huxley. And in 1946, right after World War II, shortly before they started the Nuremberg trials, he said something to the effect of, because he was also the president of the British Eugenics Society. So he said something to the effect of, oh, Hitler gave eugenics a bad name, but pretty soon we're going to be able to talk about it openly again. And in that context, I realized that they had really co-opted everything that we as normal people find that it makes sense. For example, he was one of the co-founders of the World Wildlife Fund. So they have infiltrated everything. That's why I keep saying disconnect from all of this, set up our own system, self-sufficient, totally independent from these organizations.
Well, absolutely. I mean, we can't even rely on the UN anymore. Okay.
Oh,
I
no
mean,
way.
the World Health Organization was funded from the outset by the Rockefellers, and
Yeah.
people don't know that it had already a label, and there are other entities of the UN, and now the complete UN. I come from a United Nations family, so and I know the intricacies of what was happening, but there was a period where there was some hope, particularly, in the countries would get together, but all that was also staged. United Nations Conference for Trade and Development, and so on and so forth. And then, of course, it was the WTO in 1995, which was illegally imposed because then it controls intellectual property rights worldwide. Now, but I don't see. So I think that what is very important is that people who are anti-war have to be also integrated into an understanding of this COVID narrative, because we're not going to go anywhere if the resistance are divided. We have to. I don't think we should confront them in an aggressive way. I think we have to enter into dialogue, even with people who are funded by the Rockefellers. Sometimes they don't even realize it, and the people funded by Soros. I think but then we have to understand what kind of resistance we have to put forth, and it's also another aspect that this is a conflict of capitalism against capitalism. Okay. We can't simply say, well, this is a class conflict. We have to look at the fact that airlines are bankrupt. The small and medium-sized enterprises are literally bankrupt already, but it's going far beyond that. So that in effect, we have to act in a way which brings all sectors of society together, the chambers of commerce and industry, and indeed the military and the politicians and so on. It's to break this consensus. And the way to break the consensus, what you have initiated is to reveal the falsehoods. Yeah. Now, when somebody says to me, when I say there is no pandemic, they say, "Oh, you must be crazy." No, I guess I am crazy. But the thing is, if I tell them that it's 83 cases on the 30th of January, and then the following day, Trump initiates the closure of air travel, okay? And then it's 1,000 cases in February. Oh, no, yes, very, very dangerous, blah, blah, blah. But and then we have all the data on the vaccine. We know all the impacts. We've documented that, and it's all corroborated. And it's corroborated. We discussed that last time because now we have a report by Pfizer, which has been made available to the public through freedom of information, and we have all the data, and we can say very clearly that if on the 28th of February 2021 when they reviewed their report, the first thing would have been to say, we can't implement this vaccine because there are deaths, there's mortality and morbidity based on our own data. Okay? And I think what I said that's the transition from manslaughter into genocide, in effect.
Yeah.
And
it's not just Pfizer. It's not just Pfizer, because what Pfizer knew, the FDA knew as well.
Of course, the FDA had all the information, and the governments had all the information, most probably, and the EU government had the information, because that was part of their negotiation for liability and so on. But now, I mean, when I see that Pfizer has already has a criminal record, it's the only company in the US which has a criminal record with the Department of Justice, at least based on their statement, for fraudulent marketing. This is not fraudulent marketing. This is going far beyond. This is genocide, and it is coupled with the economic genocide underlying the lockdowns. Okay, the lockdowns are devastating because they disorganize a whole country. Okay. And in some cases, we take the case of India, where people who are homeless, which is a large sector of the urban population because they're seasonal workers, they come in, they were precipitated into starvation. We know that. Yes. They're extensive crimes against humanity, and I mean, it's true that the PCR test ultimately is some kind of smoking gun. I was very much attacked right at the beginning, when I started talking about the PCR test, not in medical terms, but more in the justification of social measures, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And people say, no, you're absolutely crazy. Even people in the independent media, they said, no, you're crazy. So I guess we're all truth.
You hit the nail on the head. Of course, the PCR test is the smoking gun. And if you look at how they used, or rather misused, the PCR test intentionally, that's how you can prove intent, malicious infliction of harm. And that's what we're going to do. But in the meantime, I find it okay, and I find it very helpful that if in those jurisdictions where the justices are not willing to look into the scientific evidence, you just go other routes, just like what Bobby Ann described. You just attack the authority of the administrative state to issue such regulations, which they then call laws, or which they think are laws. But the PCR test is at the core of this. It is the foundation. It is the cornerstone. If you kick that out from under them, you kick the legs out from under them. Sooner or later, we're going to do that.
Well, certainly. The other aspect. What was I going to say? Yeah.
You're saying that the military is involved in this. It's very obvious from Johns Hopkins Health Security. It's very obvious that the hot war with rockets and hand grenades and fighter planes, etc., has given way to a much smoother, silent war, but it's just as deadly, probably even deadlier. It's the pandemic now.
No, precisely, and I think that the wars, and as well as the sanctions, as well as the regime changes, are all integrated. It's one agenda, which is serving the same group. So it's the extensive military-industrial complex, which, with their $1 trillion nuclear weapons program, 1.3 trillion right now, going up by the year to 2030. They say it's going to be even more. I think goes up to 2 trillion. But the thing is that we're at a very dangerous crossroads, because the sophistication of war making is there, and this COVID-19 agenda, coupled, let's say, with what now what they're now preparing is the pandemic treaty, where they've already announced, they said, well, we'll have at least 10 pandemics from now until 2030. Okay. Now, how do they know? How does Bill Gates know how many pandemics they're going to? And then he said he comes up in a statement on the monkeypox thing, and he said, 10 airports with about 100 cases or whatever, and it's a terrorist attack between two countries. Okay, and then there's a simulation of that. But how on earth does he know, coincidence after coincidence, conspiracy theories, that on the 12th of March, on the 12th of May, the World Health Organization announces 10 countries, implying 10 airports possibly, and about the same number as what was in the simulation. And then the simulation, which was actually, I've looked at that simulation, but it's not strictly a big pharma simulation. It's a national security agenda, because they went through two stages. But essentially, they had their specialists in biotechnology, and biological weapons, and then they also had big pharma and this, that, and other. And they come up with very similar. Then they said, the pandemic has started. The monkeypox pandemic has started on the 15th of May, 2022. Okay. Now that's what happened in real life. I don't think that this is necessarily going to emerge in the same way as COVID, but it is there as a propaganda mechanism to justify the signing of the pandemic treaty, which in essence involves the creation of a giant data bank of 7.9 billion people worldwide, with their personal details, their banking details, their, whatever, their education. I think that they have, in each of these data files, they can put several thousand concepts. And so it becomes an instrument of global governance. And that, of course, is the end game. It's global governance, which Rockefeller, the late David Rockefeller, defined as the alliance between bankers and intellectuals. Obviously, we're not part of those intellectuals, but certainly people like Ferguson, all the corruption at the level of these so-called scientists, like Ferguson or Drosten and et al., they're all paid by Gates. Yeah. Ferguson is paid by Gates. Drosten paid by Gates. Of course, Tedros receives millions from Gates, but we don't have necessarily the paper trail of that. But there we are. We are in a situation of corruption at the planetary level, and as you said, the eugenics is there. Whether we name it as eugenics, we're seeing the impact of the vaccine worldwide.
Well, the sooner we stop mincing words and playing their game, the sooner we call a spade, I think the quicker people will understand what's really going on. When you're saying this is economic warfare, it obviously is. The first such exercise, I don't know if you remember this, but that was Operation Dark Winter. That was conducted in military style. One of the people who participated is James Bush, and he testified on our model grand jury proceeding. But afterwards, they tried to hide the military in the background. However, you can still see that it's there through Johns Hopkins Health Security and through the fact that the German Ministry of Health is really being run by a general. So it's all there. It's all there. It's in your face. What they're doing is, after you explained it again, what they're doing is they're telling us, you stupid imbeciles, if we tell you to jump off the bridge because there's a pandemic, you're going to do it. That's what they're doing.
Precisely, and I mean, what is very dangerous there is that they have at their disposal a whole set of weapon systems, and the Russians do as well. Nuclear. I've spent a good part of the last few years investigating nuclear weapons and also simulations of nuclear war. There are tons of them. Only a few have been made public. And the RAND Corporation has made the simulation, and they say that we can win the nuclear war. Well, they're absolutely wrong there, but politicians like that, they could run for an election, which will never take place.
Yeah.
We're going to win the nuclear war, and next, yeah. So, but I mean, right now, well, I'm at the same time I'm following what's happening in Ukraine. And I can say that there is no avenue other than the peace initiative, which was already initiated in Istanbul under the auspices of the Turkish government of Erdogan, which is not particularly a pacifist. But the thing is, the Ukrainians, irrespective of all the money that's coming in, they do not have they don't have access. They don't have access to the Sea of Azov. Okay, the Ukrainians don't have access to the Sea of Azov because the Russians control the Kerch Strait, which is right at the extremity of Crimea. And if they don't have access to the Sea of Azov, and they don't have a navy, and the air force has been destroyed right from the beginning, the only avenue for them is to negotiate a peace treaty. But I think they're being pushed into a possible, the possibility of a nuclear war is there. It's there because that may be part of a decision-making process. And particularly now when they have categorized nuclear weapons as harmless to civilians, we're in a very, very dangerous situation. But I think what we have to do at this stage is to bring it to extend the anti-war movement and the anti-COVID narrative movement. We have to mesh them together because we're dealing with the same process, very, very sophisticated acts of warfare, climatic warfare, nuclear warfare, biological warfare, propaganda, all the gamut of regime change, corruption, digital, of course, the digital dimension of against humanity, of transforming people into transhumans. All of that is linked together. And I think we have to take a stance, and also the thing is not to fragment. I notice that people on the left are fragmented. Okay, well, the left and the right should join together. We're not talking about party politics here. We're talking about humanity, and in other words, we're not talking strictly about racism or whatever. It's a much more extensive battle that we have to wage, and we must, given the nature of decision making and the power behind it, we have to enter the ranks of the military, of the public sector, of the business corporations, because there's a grassroots there. People in the military have to be part of this movement. People in the public sector must be part of this movement. And of course, the problems that you're facing with the judicial, okay. Well, we don't have many progressive judges running around anymore. At least I'm trying to initiate some action here, and I can't get a lawyer to go after the Trudeau government in relation to the vaccine, for instance. Can't do it.
How do you see? I think I've asked you this before, but how do you see what role is Russia or Putin playing in this? And on the other hand, what's going on? There's another BRIC country. What's going on in Brazil? It seems I spoke to someone who knows the situation in Brazil pretty well. He says, well, it looks as though the WEF, the Bilderbergers, they're now going into hiding. They're doing everything behind closed doors, WHO as well. But it looks as though they have already, for them, it's a foregone conclusion that Bolsonaro is going to lose the elections. Instead, Lula is going to be reinstated by them, running on one promise. And the guy who told me this wasn't joking. He said, running on one promise, which is, if you elect me, I'm not going to steal everything from you again.
Listen, I know Lula. I met him before he was in opposition at the time. But I can tell you, and I've been blacklisted in Brazil for that because I said that Lula was neoliberalism with a human face. He was co-opted right from the beginning of his presidency, and the central bank of Brazil was handed over to Wall Street Meirelles, who was actually the president of he was with some very powerful banking interests, etc. It was a neoliberal agenda, and throughout his career, and then he sent troops to Haiti. He was friends with George W. Bush. He's the ideal leader for them, and the people on the left are supporting him. Everybody's supporting him. Now, Bolsonaro, I'm not a fan of Bolsonaro, but the thing is that we don't have there's no progressive alternative in Brazil. And what these elites, what they like is that they can have a proxy which has a human face and which is a former trade union leader and so on, and who doesn't necessarily understand issues of debt. Lula doesn't understand what the debt is all about. And he obeys orders. So he's the ideal candidate. But that is the model in many other countries. Okay.
Yeah.
As long as these leftists are part of the alliance, unfortunately, and I'm not talking about the grassroots, but the leftist leaders are co-opted. And
all of them seem to be products of the World Economic Forum's Young Global Leaders program. So there you have it. Of course, they follow orders. If you take a closer look, they don't have any biography. Or if they do, it's fake, complete fake. Some of them have some rhetorical skills, but that's about it. What about Putin, though? That's a really interesting figure in this chess game.
Well, you're right. It's very mysterious. I think that Putin is very... has an ability as a former intelligence agent. He was with the KGB. He strategizes his relations, and he builds diplomatic alliances of a cross-cutting nature. So he's allied with Turkey, and then he will try also to have inroads into to maintain good relations with the European Union. But why is it that Russia adopted the COVID narrative? I suspect that there are interests among it's a capitalist country, and it has oligarchs. We only call oligarchs when it's Russia or China, but they have their business interests there in the pharmaceutical industry. I know that they had an alliance with AstraZeneca. Definitely that they have that alliance between two pharmaceutical companies. Now, you could say, why did Cuba accept it? Cuba was in despair. The only real component of its economy was the pharmaceutical industry. which was launched. It was launched in the 90s, and it was there really as well. It was a response to the end of the Cold War and the relations that they had with the Soviet bloc. But I know, and I know that the Cuban pharmaceutical industry has links to GlaxoSmithKline, and that's long-standing. And the leadership is, I would say, the post-Castro leadership is co-opted. I've been to Cuba. I'm not. They don't invite me anymore. But I had a personal relationship with Fidel Castro, who invited me to his home for a period of 4 days, and we discussed it. We were mainly discussing the nuclear issue, and his voice was very important. He had withdrawn from politics that was in 2010. But the post-Castro leadership, they made some very stupid mistakes. But they were in they were caught into the threat of these sanctions, which go back to the late 50s, but again, also Venezuela. Why would Venezuela accept this and go along with it? They must have had pressures from the United States to do it. And without understanding that the World Health Organization was controlled by Wall Street. So, but that's the kind of thing we have to address, because we don't really have progressive countries anymore. What happened to the welfare state in the European Union, Yugoslavia? Community of nations. And we certainly don't have democracy in the People's Republic of China. That's another dimension, and they're caught into this. They're caught into the narrative, and they're complicit in the narrative.
It seems like that country is a totally lost cause, right?
Pardon?
I get the impression that China is a totally lost cause.
Well, China's part of the consensus because they're the chief executive of China CDC, which is the comparable to the US CDC. Chinese Center for Disease Control and Prevention is Dr. George Gaofu. And Gaofu actually was involved in the 2001 exercise, and he was also involved in the monkeypox simulation. So he is very much linked up to the, he's linked up to he's a graduate of Oxford. He's linked up to the Harvard group, the John Hopkins. He's a fellow. He was a fellow of the Wellcome Foundation. He responds to their interests and not necessarily to those of the Chinese government. But that Chinese government is also divided, has some very powerful and wealthy multi-billionaires, which are there, and also now, I've been following rather indirectly the Shanghai crisis, how they managed to the closure of Shanghai starting in March, and it's still ongoing, but it was based again on PCR tests, fake data, and it was based on directives which came from the upper spheres of the health establishment, including Gaofu. Gaofu is a friend of Fauci. He doesn't deny it. He calls him my longtime friend, Fauci, Gaofu. Okay, they know each other, and there we are. The situation in China during the pandemic, and I've been in contact with people, is far more devastating than what we have experienced, because they're using the QR code to regulate people's movements. So they say you have to take a PCR test every 48 hours. Those in Shanghai and several other large urban areas. You have to take a QR test. You have to take a COVID PCR test every 48 hours. And when the time elapses, your QR code on your cell phone goes from green to orange, okay? It goes from green to yellow, okay? And then it says if you're not allowed to walk you're not allowed to go anywhere. So the person who doesn't do it every 48 hours then is confined, and it's regulated through the cell phone. And people who don't have cell phones, they are totally marginalized. And that's including people, older people who are living in a different era. They simply say these people are simply marginalized totally. They don't have access to health. They don't have access to food. They don't have access to restaurants and so on. So that they've been regulating their population with this QR code on the cell phone, and it is modeled. It's not the Chinese leadership which has imposed this. It is the complicity of Chinese officials and scientists, which are linked up to the Fauci Gates gang and Tedros.
Yeah.
And Gao Fu is everywhere. I mean, he's invited to all these venues.
We got a closer look. We got a closer look of how this gang, which is using WHO as a kind of crowbar, how this gang infiltrated and tried to take away the sovereignty from a very small country by the name of Vanuatu. Two politicians, active politicians, told us how the WHO sent two people who the Vanuatu government thought were advisors, because they didn't even have any cases there, advisors in these difficult times, a doctor from Korea and a woman doctor from France, who all of a sudden decided to give the government orders. So that's a direct invasion of that country's sovereignty. So what's the upshot of all this? We shouldn't, that's what you're saying. You're saying we shouldn't, we must not allow the resistance to be fragmented, because that's what they're trying to do, divide and conquer. At the same time, we should see that the other side is fragmented. There's infighting going on. So if we reach those pockets of resistance that exists on the other side, in the military, in the airline industry, for example, I think that is probably going to be important. That's why we should keep talking even to these people, not just to our own echo chamber.
No, absolutely. I mean, you have to, this is something which is affecting everybody, particularly in view of the fact that the vaccine has been extended to a large share of the world population. And particularly in view of the fact that we have millions of families who have lost their assets, farmers who have been driven into poverty and so on. We have to be consistent in solidarity with all sectors of society. Okay, in other words, that includes local capitalists as well. I mean, at this stage in our history, we have to restore the real economy. And we have to ensure that the real economy is not simply taken over by Bill Gates or et al. Okay, because that's really what is at stake, and that's what was at stake in all these IMF reforms. You privatize. Okay, you can't pay your debt. Okay, you have to privatize. Privatize your cities. We'll sell them on the free market. That is what the creditors are going to. We haven't reached that point yet. We have the most serious debt crisis in world history. I can say that. I don't have the figures on that because they don't reveal the figures. But I can see it the way they spend their money. Now, if they spend them, the Canadian government has spent more than $2 billion to purchase the antigen and home tests. Okay, out of the budget, out of taxpayers' revenues. Okay, and in the meantime, health is collapsing, education is collapsing, etc., etc. Then they're sending billions of dollars to Ukraine. The whole fabric is sustained by global debt, and those creditors will come in and say, "Well, listen, you owe us money, and if you don't repay, well, we're going to make sure that you go." Now, I think we have to question the legitimacy of that debt, of those debts.
Exactly.
The debts
exactly.
created. These are odious debts.
How about? Because I think that is the point. You said we have to restore the real economy. That's what it's all about. In order to restore the real economy, we have to get out of the stranglehold of these basically private, criminals. I include the WMF. I include the World Bank. Just disconnect from them. Tell them to go to hell, collect their money amongst themselves. And then all of a sudden, the stranglehold will be gone. It's just us, the people, each of us individually, that has to realize that we have our own sovereignty. Who cares? We're not going to pay back the debt, which is only in existence because they drove us there by taking our assets and our money away from us.
Well, I mean, to do that, we have to start to reveal how those financial interests actually enrich themselves. Okay. Now, we have data on that. Irony is the economists have, it's the Policy Institute in Washington. They've come out with how it's focusing on the billionaires, but of course it's much broader than that. But they have literally more than doubled their wealth in the course of these 2 years. I don't have I've had the figures for the first year, but what I'm saying is that we can say that they are fraudulent, okay, and that they have accumulated wealth in a fraudulent way. But then we have to go. I think really it's not the smoking gun, but because it is a gun. It's the whole issue of propaganda. We have to disable the propaganda apparatus, because what the media is saying are the lies. They're not even reflecting on official data. We base ourselves on official data as far as the vaccine is concerned, mortality, morbidity, the Pfizer report. There's nothing in the mainstream media on that. And so that has to be done also, I think, it has to be done at the grassroots. These are powerful conglomerates, Reuters et al., but we're not going against grassroots journalists, some of which are protesting to that, but some of them which are already have been groomed. But we have to sustain the independent media, and now we're being closed down. Global research, this is more than 20 years that we started up, and now we in the month of May we were subjected to a cyber attack. Can you imagine? Over one week, 70 million what they call malicious requests. Okay, it's there to destabilize your website. And then on top of that, you have censorship, you have smears, and so on and so forth. And I even have very great difficulty getting the Canadian media. And so it's I think there's a lot. I think the key to this resistance movement is solidarity universally, not limited to one country. Okay, not limited to one country. It has to. We have to join hands around the world with people who are suffering in different parts of the planet, and of course revealing the lies is the key. But that process of revealing the lies is being hampered in various ways, and people are threatened. Now you mentioned the case of Vanuatu. That operation has probably taken place in every single country on the planet, and in some cases in a more aggressive way than what Vanuatu experienced, because it's a small island country. But mind you, they need a universal acceptance. Now that was probably planned way ahead of the lockdown. They had it all. They had their people, and they use private consulting firms like McKinsey, who goes in and then says, "Well, we can support your election campaign. Just tell us where we have to send the money." Now, I noticed William Engdahl has brought out a very interesting article on that regarding the election process in the U.S. So there we are. Well, I think, yes, let's join hands and hope that we can and integrate the anti-war, and also the whole issue of neoliberalism has to be addressed in one single movement.
You're saying it's grassroots. Yes, I agree. It's grassroots. What we have to do is, in order to, as you phrased it, restore the real economy, we have to do it in our regions and then connect with each other. But first, we have to do it in our regions. Someone just told me Mexico is totally ungovernable. I find that a positive thing, because it turns out that in Mexico, many of the regions are totally independent. They don't care what the government tells them. They're doing what they feel is right. And that's what democracy is all about. So those regions that have already disconnected from these global corporations and global NGOs, they should then connect with each other, exchange the best ideas. And that's how you get global or universal solidarity, as you put it.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. We have to have grassroots endeavors, but we also have to have mechanisms of coordinating, and we have to inform our fellow citizens that this is not simply a local crisis, because most people don't, and it's not a critique, but most people don't understand that this is happening in the entire planet, But then we have to have mechanisms of confronting. But it essentially, well, to make a historical comparison, this is an inquisitorial environment. Okay. Now the Spanish Inquisition, the French Inquisition was even worse. The Spanish Inquisition lasted 300 years. But essentially, it's the imposition of an inquisitorial doctrine. And it then enforces itself by obedience and submission. We have to break that, and that consensus is very fragile right now, and I think there also, of course, there's sort of in between rhetorics would say, well, they made a mistake. Now they're coming out with, Neil Ferguson made a mistake. He didn't make a mistake. He was paid with his math. All my life, I've dealt with mathematical models. I know what they do. But Gates told him what to put in the model, and he comes out, I've estimated, Scientific, Imperial College of London. Now, but we now have people who are coming forth and saying, well, there were mistakes made, we must evaluate that, and so on. That is nonsense. And that simply is going to say, well, yes, they made a mistake. They didn't make a mistake. They falsified the data, and so on.
And we should, what we should do, I'm sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say what we should do is we should have you on another time because one of the key points of getting out the truth is to, as you said it, show how they enrich themselves. That's going to make people really angry. That's going to make them think twice about who these guys who are giving us orders, who they really are.
Well, I have 2 chapters on that in my ebook. I don't have an English language publisher as yet, but it came out in Japan a month ago, and it looks like it's doing well. But I've got all the data on how they enrich themselves. And
let's talk about that next time.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is also Michael Hudson has come up with he's an economist, come up with a very interesting book on some of the issues we've discussed about the economy, but he hasn't addressed the COVID crisis whatsoever. It's as if the COVID crisis, the virus, is responsible for the crash of the financial markets. Yeah. And that is the consensus. They say, oh, the virus triggered collapse, and then eventually they go to China to pay, give us some refunds, for all the damage that you've done. But we also have to confront. I think the doctors are doing fabulous work, but they're still confined in their understanding, and that's not a critique. But that we have dialogue with medical doctors and scientists. We have no dialogue with we should have dialogue with people at the grassroots, trade union leaders. We should have dialogue with sociologists, political scientists. I mean, the geopolitics of this crisis are there, okay? And how is it at the universities? It's completely censored. You can't discuss this. Particularly among so-called progressive groups. So that's why.
Well, I think so long as people start from the assumption that the virus is causing everything, they're definitely barking up the wrong tree, and they're not going to make the right choices.
Well, absolutely. I mean, I think we can prove quite categorically that the virus is not the cause of this crisis, because just looking at the numbers, irrespective of the PCR, the numbers are so ridiculously low. When they announced the pandemic on March 11, 2020, 44,000 cases worldwide out of China, positive cases. But again, and then even if we take the definitions of the WHO on COVID-19, where they describe it, they say, oh yes, the 5% could be very serious, but they give a definition whether this is true or not. But that's their definition. Okay. Now that definition was never revealed in the mainstream media. They said it's similar to seasonal influenza, blah blah blah. And you recover within 10 days. They say it black on white, and then not a word in the mainstream media. So that's where confrontation, I mean, if the mainstream media, if we had control of the mainstream media for 48 hours, public opinion worldwide would shift inevitably.
Exactly. Well, we do have something at the end of our session today. There is a video clip. I think it's about 13 minutes or so. I think you'll find it extremely funny. There's an American comedian by the name of J.P. Sears who explains everything you're saying, but in an extremely funny way. So I want to thank you very, very much for taking the time. And if you have a little bit longer, you should watch that clip because it's extremely funny.
Right. I will definitely watch it. And I also, another thing we would like to feature your programs on a regular basis on global research. We on a daily basis will ensure that there's a space for that. But I have to receive them in it comes out in video. So
great.
We have featured some of we've featured your writings, and we've featured several of the videos, but I think we should be doing it on a regular basis. And we do have a very extensive readership.
Excellent.
Despite censorship. So alles gut und beste Danke.
Vielen Dank.
Vielen Dank.
Vielen Dank.
Vielen Dank. Das war ausgezeichnet. Mein Deutsch
Fand ich auch.
Mein Deutsch ist furchtbar schlecht. Habe ich keine Gelegenheit, Deutsch zu sprechen. So.
Nein, das ist perfekt.
Okay. Bye for now.
Okay.
Vielen Dank.
Bis später. Ja.
Bye.
Tschüss.